The night Elijah crossed the Chattahoochee River, he carried nothing but the scars on his back and a stolen knife tucked into his belt. The water ran cold in October, black as pitch under the canopy of pines that stretched endlessly into the Georgia wilderness. Behind him, 3 days south, the Thornton plantation burned in his memory, not with fire, but with the sound of Mary's scream when the overseer took her to the barn. That scream had followed him through swamps and across ridgelines, pushing him north when his legs wanted to collapse. When the hounds got close enough that he could hear their handlers shouting his name into the darkness. But the dogs had gone quiet 2 miles back, and that scared him more than their barking ever had. Elijah pulled himself onto the northern bank, his clothes heavy with river water, and crouched in the undergrowth. The forest here felt different than the groomed edges of plantation land, older, wilder. The trees grew so thick that moonlight barely touched the ground, and the silence pressed against his ears like a living thing. He waited, listening for the sounds that meant death, hoofbeats, voices, the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Instead, he heard nothing. Just wind moving through leaves and the distant call of an owl. He was about to move when a voice spoke from the darkness, calm and unbothered. "You gonna sit there all night, or you gonna tell me why you're worth the trouble?" Elijah spun, knife out, heart hammering. He saw no one. The forest remained empty, shadows within shadows. "What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you." "Easy." The voice came from a different direction now, behind him. "I'm not the one you need to cut." A figure materialized from the trees. A Cherokee man, maybe 40 years old, wearing buckskin leggings and a dark shirt that seemed to drink the moonlight. His hair was long, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face carried the kind of stillness that comes from watching things die. He held no weapon that Elijah could see, but something about his posture suggested he didn't need one. "How long you been following me?" Elijah asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Since you left the dogs behind." The man tilted his head slightly. "You move quiet for someone who's never lived in the woods. But quiet isn't invisible. Not here." Elijah's grip tightened on the knife. "You gonna turn me in?" The Cherokee man studied him for a long moment, then made a sound that might have been a laugh. "If I wanted to turn you in, I'd have let the dogs find you. They were 10 minutes from ripping your throat out when I crossed their path." He gestured toward the south. "They won't be tracking anyone anymore." A chill ran down Elijah's spine that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "What did you do? What needed doing?" The man stepped closer, and Elijah saw his eyes clearly for the first time, dark and sharp, carrying something ancient and unforgiving. "My name is Tasunke, and you're trespassing on Cherokee land. What remains of it, anyway?" "I'm just passing through," Elijah said quickly. "Heading north. Canada, maybe." "Canada's 1,000 miles through hostile territory. You won't make it 20. Tasunki crossed his arms. "But there's another option, one that doesn't involve running until you drop dead or get caught." Elijah hesitated. Every instinct screamed not to trust anyone, not after what he'd seen, what he'd survived. But standing in that forest, facing a man who'd somehow killed trained hunting dogs without making a sound, he realized he had nothing left but bad choices. "What option?" he asked. Tasunki turned and began walking deeper into the woods, moving with the kind of effortless grace that made no sound against the forest floor. "Follow me, and keep your mouth shut until we're past the outer markers. There are things in these woods worse than dogs." Elijah followed because there was nowhere else to go. They walked for an hour through terrain that seemed to shift and blur in the darkness. Tasunke never hesitated, never checked his direction, moving as though the forest itself was guiding him. Twice, Elijah thought he saw movement in the periphery, shapes that vanished when he looked directly at them. Once, Tasunke raised a hand, and they both froze, while something large passed through the underbrush 30 yards to their left. Whatever it was, it sounded like it walked on 2 legs. When they finally stopped, it was at the edge of a ravine Elijah hadn't seen coming. The land simply dropped away into darkness, and at the bottom he could make out the faint glow of fires. "Down there," Tasunke said, pointing to a narrow path that zigzagged down the cliff face. "That's where you'll find what's left of my people, and others like you." Elijah stared at him. "Others?" "Runaways, escapees, people who decided dying free was better than living in chains." Tasunke's voice carried no emotion, just statement of fact. "We've been taking them in for months now. Since the soldiers started forcing us west. The Trail of Tears," Elijah whispered. He'd heard about it even on the plantation, whispered conversations between house slaves about entire Cherokee families being marched away at gunpoint, their land seized by the government and sold to white settlers. Tasunke's jaw tightened. "They call it removal. We call it murder by another name." He turned to face Elijah fully. "But we're not leaving. Not all of us. Some of us decided we'd rather bleed this land red than abandon it. And when your people started showing up, desperate and half-dead, we saw an opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" "To teach you how to be more than prey." Tasunke started down the path. "Come on, the others will want to meet you." The descent took 20 minutes, and by the time they reached the bottom, Elijah's legs were shaking. The ravine opened into a natural hollow, hidden so completely by the cliff walls and tree cover that you could walk within 50 feet of it and never know it existed. The fires he'd seen from above belonged to a small camp, maybe 15 rough shelters built against the rock face. Smoke from the cooking fires channeled up through natural chimneys in the stone that dispersed it before it could be seen from above. And the people. Elijah had expected a handful of refugees huddled in the dark. Instead, he found dozens. Cherokee families, yes, elders and children, women working hides and preparing food, but also black faces, men and women who carried themselves with the same haunted wariness Elijah felt in his bones. Some were young, barely more than teenagers. Others bore the grey hair and bent backs of field labourers who'd survived decades of brutality. A woman approached as they entered the camp, Cherokee, maybe 30, with a rifle slung across her back and a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw. She looked at Elijah, then at Tasunke, and raised an eyebrow. "Another one?" she asked in English, though her accent carried the musical lilt of her native tongue underneath. "Found him at the river. Thornton plantation." Tasunke gestured to Elijah. The dogs were close. The woman's expression shifted to something like respect. "You outran Thornton's hounds? Those are some of the meanest animals in 3 counties. "I didn't outrun them," Elijah admitted. "They just stopped coming." Tasunke and the woman exchanged a look. "Tell him," she said. "The dogs are dead," Tasunke said flatly. "I made sure of it. And I left their handlers with a message." Elijah felt the weight of that statement settle over the camp. Conversations had stopped. People were watching now, waiting. "What message?" Elijah asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Tasunke pulled something from his belt and held it up. A slave collar, the metal still stained with blood, now split cleanly in half. Beside it, a white eagle feather. "We left this nailed to a tree where the bodies were hanging," Tasunke said. "So they'll know, so they'll understand what they're dealing with." Elijah stared at the symbols. His throat felt tight. "And what are they dealing with?" The woman stepped forward, her voice quiet but carrying through the hollow like a blade. "An alliance they can't buy off or beat down. Cherokee warriors who refused to leave their land, and freed slaves who refused to die in chains. We're training an army in these woods, teaching survival and warfare to anyone brave enough or desperate enough to join. We raid supply lines, we ambush patrols. We make this land so dangerous for slavers and soldiers that they think twice before stepping into the forest." She paused, letting the words sink in. They're already calling us the Night Brotherhood. By spring, they'll be calling us a nightmare. Elijah looked around the camp, at faces hardened by loss, but burning with something he hadn't seen in years. Purpose, defiance, hope, wrapped in violence. "What if I want to join?" he heard himself ask. Tasunke smiled for the first time, and it was the smile of a wolf. "Then welcome to the forest, brother. We've got a lot to teach you." The training started before dawn. Elijah woke to a hand clamped over his mouth and Tasunke's voice whispering in his ear. "If this was a raid, you'd be dead. Get up." He stumbled out of the lean-to shelter they'd given him, still half asleep, to find 24 others already assembled in the center of the hollow. The fire pits had been extinguished, and the only light came from the pre-dawn grey, filtering down through the trees. The air tasted like frost and pine sap. Tasunke stood before them, arms crossed, flanked by the scarred woman, whose name Elijah had learned was Adsila, and an older black man built like a bear, with white hair and hands the size of dinner plates. His name was Solomon, and rumor in the camp said he'd killed an overseer with those hands before escaping from a plantation near Savannah. "Listen carefully," Tasunke began, his voice pitched low but carrying. "Most of you came here thinking survival meant running fast and hiding well. That might keep you alive for a month, maybe 2, but if you want to live, if you want to fight, you need to become something else entirely." He gestured to the forest surrounding them. "This land is Cherokee. Every tree, every rock, every stream has a name and a purpose. Our people have walked these paths for thousands of years. We know where the earth is soft enough to hide tracks. We know which plants will heal wounds and which will kill a man in minutes. We know how to move through the forest like wind, invisible, untraceable." Adsila stepped forward. "And now we're going to teach you, not because we're kind, not because we pity you, but because an alliance only works if both sides can hold their own." Solomon spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. "You're going to learn to hunt, to track, to kill without hesitation. Most importantly, you're going to learn when to strike and when to vanish. Because the men hunting us don't care if you're armed or not. They'll hang you just for being out here." A young woman near the front, barely 20 with burn scars on her arms, raised her hand tentatively. "How long do we train?" Tasunke's expression didn't change. "Until you stop making mistakes that get people killed. For some of you, that'll be weeks. For others, months. And some of you won't make it at all." The camp fell silent. "First lesson starts now," Tasunke continued. "Tracking. You're going to pair up. 1 Cherokee, 1 runaway. The Cherokee will move through the forest, and the runaway will try to follow their trail. When you fail, and you will fail, you'll learn why. Move out." Elijah found himself paired with a Cherokee man named Kuwanyoma, who looked about 18, but moved with the confidence of someone twice that age. They headed into the forest together, Kuwanyoma in the lead, and within 30 seconds, Elijah had completely lost sight of him. He spent the next hour stumbling through underbrush, trying to find any sign of passage. Broken branches? None. Disturbed leaves? Nothing. It was like Kuwanyoma had turned into smoke. When he finally gave up and stood still, frustrated and embarrassed, Kuwanyoma appeared beside him. So close Elijah could have touched him. "You were looking for the wrong things," Kuwanyoma said, not unkindly. "White men crash through the forest like drunk cattle. They break branches, kick up dirt, leave tracks everywhere. We don't move like that." He pointed to a section of ground that looked identical to everything else around it. "See here? The moss is slightly compressed. That's where I stepped. And there," he indicated a small branch hanging at an odd angle. "I bent that deliberately, so anyone tracking me would waste time examining it while I moved in a different direction entirely." Elijah shook his head. "How am I supposed to see that?" "Practice, patience, and understanding that the forest is alive." Kuwanyama crouched down, running his fingers over the earth. "Everything here is connected. When you walk, you disturb that connection. My people learn to step so lightly that the disruption is barely noticeable. You will too. They spent the rest of the morning practicing. Kuanyama would walk 20 paces, and Elijah would try to follow the trail. Again and again, he failed. But slowly, incrementally, he started to see things he'd missed before. A slight indentation in soft dirt, a spider's web broken at the edge, the way certain plants bent when weight passed beside them. By midday, when they returned to camp, Elijah's head throbbed with concentration, but he felt something shift inside him, a tiny seed of understanding about how to read the language of the forest. The afternoon brought weapons training. Solomon took charge of this session, distributing wooden practice weapons to everyone, carved replicas of tomahawks, knives, and short clubs. The real weapons, he explained, would only be earned after proving competence. "Most of you have never held anything more dangerous than a hoe," Solomon said, pacing before them. "That's a problem, because when you face a man trying to kill you, hesitation means death." He demonstrated basic strikes with a practiced tomahawk. Quick, brutal motions designed to disable or kill efficiently. No flourishes, no wasted movement, just violence distilled to its essential form. "The Cherokee fight differently than white soldiers," Solomon continued. "They don't stand in lines and shoot at each other from a distance. They ambush. They strike from shadows and vanish before the enemy can respond. That's what we're going to teach you." Elijah partnered with a woman named Ruth, who'd escaped from an Alabama plantation 2 months ago. They practiced the motions Solomon demonstrated, strikes, blocks, footwork, until their arms burned and sweat soaked through their clothes despite the cool air. Ruth moved with surprising grace, her attacks precise, even when Elijah fumbled his defenses. "You worked in the fields?" he asked during a brief rest. "House slave," she corrected, her voice flat. "Until the master's son decided I'd look better in his bed than serving dinner. I put a candlestick through his eye and ran." She glanced at Elijah. "You?" "Fields. Cotton, mostly." He flexed his scarred hands. "Overseer named Carver liked to use his whip. I got tired of counting the lashes." Ruth nodded, understanding passing between them without further words. This was the common language of the camp. Stories of brutality, moments when the choice became resist or die inside. As the afternoon wore on, Tasunki appeared and pulled Elijah aside. "You're picking things up faster than most. Good instincts." He gestured toward a section of the ravine wall where weapons hung, real ones this time. Bows, tomahawks, knives, and even a few muskets. But instincts only take you so far. "Tomorrow, you're going on your first patrol." Elijah's stomach tightened. "Already? We don't have time to wait until you're perfect. There's a slave-catching patrol working the territory 30 miles south. 5 men, well-armed, been tracking refugees for weeks. They caught a woman 2 days ago, dragged her back to the Whitmore plantation." Tasunki's voice went cold. "We're going to remind them that hunting humans has consequences." "You're going to kill them," Elijah said. Not a question. "We're going to make them disappear," Tasunki corrected, "so completely that when other patrols hear about it, they think twice before venturing into these woods. Fear is a weapon, Elijah, sometimes more powerful than any blade." That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay in his shelter, staring at the rock ceiling, thinking about what tomorrow would bring. He'd never killed anyone before, never even come close. The idea of it sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. But then he thought about Mary's scream, about the scars on his back, about the woman Ruth mentioned, dragged back to a plantation to face punishment that would make death seem merciful. And he realized something that both terrified and liberated him. He wasn't afraid of what he might become. He was afraid he'd waited too long to become it. Around midnight, someone slipped into his shelter, Ruth, carrying a small bundle. She sat down across from him without asking permission. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Tasunki told me about tomorrow." She nodded. "I heard. I'm going too. 3rd patrol for me." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing a hunting knife with a bone handle. Adsila gave me this after my first. Said every person who survives their first raid earns their blade. Elijah studied the knife. In the dim light, it looked less like a tool and more like a promise. What was it like, your first time? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Terrifying. We ambushed a supply wagon heading to a plantation. 3 guards. Tasunki and Solomon handled 2 of them before they even knew we were there. The third one saw me, looked right at me, and I froze, just stood there while he raised his rifle. What happened? Adsila put an arrow through his throat before he could fire. Ruth touched the knife handle gently. She told me afterward that fear is normal, that it keeps you alive, keeps you sharp, but you can't let it paralyze you. You have to move through it. And the second time? Elijah asked. I didn't freeze, Ruth said simply. She stood, rewrapping the knife. Get some sleep. Tomorrow you'll need every advantage you can get. After she left, Elijah lay back down and closed his eyes. This time, sleep came, not peaceful, but determined. Dreams of running transformed into dreams of standing still, of facing what came, of the forest closing around him like armor. When Tasunki woke him before dawn, Elijah was already awake. Ready? Tasunki asked. Elijah thought about lies, about bravado, about all the things a man says when he's trying to convince himself he's brave. Instead, he told the truth. No, but I'm going anyway. Tasunki smiled that wolf smile again. Good answer. Let's go to war. They moved through the forest in single file, 7 of them total, Tasunki leading, followed by Adsila, Solomon, Ruth, Elijah, and 2 Cherokee warriors named Waya and Ohiteka. The sun hadn't crested the horizon yet, and the world existed in that strange in-between state, where shadows bled together and every sound felt magnified. Elijah had been given a tomahawk and a knife, both well used but sharp enough to split hair. The weapons hung from his belt, foreign and heavy, constantly reminding him of what he was walking toward. No one spoke. Hand signals passed down the line when Tasunki spotted something, a raised fist meaning stop, 2 fingers pointing left for direction change, a flat palm pressing down for crouch and hide. They'd been walking for 3 hours when Adsila suddenly held up her hand. Everyone froze. She crouched down, examining something on the ground that Elijah couldn't see from his position. After a moment, she looked back at Tasunki and nodded once. He moved forward to join her, and they had a brief, whispered conversation before Tasunki turned to address the group. Fresh tracks, he said quietly. 5 horses, moving northeast, less than an hour old. His eyes found Elijah's. This is them. The patrol we're hunting. Elijah's heart started hammering in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, remembering what Ruth had said. Fear is normal. Move through it. From here, we split up, Tasunki continued. Adsila, Waya, Ohiteka, you circle west and come at them from the high ground. Solomon, Ruth, Elijah, you're with me. We'll track them until they stop to make camp or water the horses, then we move. What if they don't stop? Ruth asked. Everyone stops eventually, Solomon rumbled. Men get tired. Horses need to drink. We just need to be patient. They split up silently, Adsila's group disappearing into the forest like they'd never existed. Tasunki led his group forward, following the tracks with the kind of focused intensity that made Elijah realize just how much he still had to learn. Where Elijah saw only dirt and leaves, Tasunki read an entire story. The pace of the horses, which rider was heavier based on the depth of the hoof prints, even which animals were favoring a leg. An hour later, they heard voices. Tasunki raised his fist, and they all dropped into crouches. Through the trees ahead, maybe 100 yards distant, Elijah could see movement, horses and men in a small clearing beside a creek. The slave catchers had stopped to water their animals and rest. Tasunki pointed to a thick stand of laurel bushes, and they crept forward until they could observe the camp clearly without being seen. 5 men, exactly as reported. 4 white, 1 black, probably a tracker they'd hired or coerced into service. They dismounted and were passing around a canteen, their rifles leaned against trees, confident in their safety this far from any plantation. Their horses drank from the creek, and one of the men was relieving himself against a pine tree, laughing at something another had said. Elijah felt a strange disconnect watching them. They looked so ordinary, no horns, no demonic features, just men. Tired, dirty men who probably had families somewhere, who maybe went to church on Sundays and told themselves they were doing honest work. But then the one who'd been laughing grabbed something from his saddlebag, a length of chain with a shackle still attached, and waved it at his companions, saying something Elijah couldn't quite hear that made them all laugh harder. And the disconnect shattered. These men hunted human beings for money. They dragged people back to lives of torture and misery. They were the reason Elijah had scars on his back, the reason Mary had screamed, the reason Ruth had a burn scar shaped like a brand on her arm. Ordinary men. Monstrous work. Tasunke made a series of hand signals. Wait. Watch. Listen. They waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The slave catchers finished their rest and began preparing to move again. One of them, a tall man with a grey beard who seemed to be the leader, was giving orders, pointing northeast along the creek bed. Then from the western ridge, a bird call echoed through the trees, except it wasn't quite right, the notes slightly off. Tasunke smiled. Adsila was in position on my signal, he whispered. Solomon takes the leader. I'll take the tracker. Ruth, Elijah, you handle whoever breaks for the horses. The rest, Adsila's team will manage. Elijah's mouth had gone dry. His hands were shaking slightly, and he gripped the tomahawk tighter to still them. Ruth noticed. She leaned close and whispered, Remember, they'd do worse to you without thinking twice. This isn't murder, it's survival. Tasunke drew his knife, the blade catching light for just an instant. He raised his other hand, 3 fingers up. 2, 1. He whistled, a perfect imitation of a hawk's cry. Everything happened at once. Adsila and her team emerged from the western ridge like vengeful spirits, arrows flying before the slave catchers even knew they were under attack. The black tracker dropped first, an arrow through his chest, dead before he hit the ground. Another man went down screaming, arrow buried in his thigh. Solomon and Tasunke burst from the laurel bushes, moving with terrifying speed. Solomon reached the grey-bearded leader in seconds, his knife flashing up and across. The leader's eyes went wide with shock and then empty. Tasunke tackled the wounded man with the arrow in his leg, silencing his screams with brutal efficiency. That left 2. They broke for the horses exactly as Tasunke had predicted, stumbling over themselves in panic, grabbing for weapons they'd left too far away. Ruth intercepted the first one, a young man, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles. He managed to get his hands on a rifle, was raising it to his shoulder when Ruth's knife found the gap between his ribs. He made a sound like a deflating bellows and collapsed. The last man, stocky, older, with a scar across his nose, made it to his horse and actually got into the saddle. He was wheeling the animal around, digging in his heels to flee, when Elijah stepped into his path. The man saw him and yanked hard on the reins. The horse reared, frightened. The man raised a pistol he'd grabbed from his saddle holster, aimed it at Elijah's chest. Time seemed to slow down. Elijah saw the man's finger tightening on the trigger, saw the calculation in his eyes. Kill or be killed. No hesitation, no mercy. Elijah threw the tomahawk. He'd practiced the motion 100 times over the past 2 days, the wooden practice weapon spinning through the air to strike targets Solomon had set up. But this was different. This was flesh and bone and consequence. The blade caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. The pistol fired, the shot going wide, and the man tumbled off the horse, hitting the ground hard. He lay there gasping, trying to reach the tomahawk buried in his shoulder, his face twisted with pain and terror. Elijah walked over slowly. His body felt strange, light and heavy at the same time, like he was moving through water. The man looked up at him. Please, he whispered. "I got a wife, 2 daughters. Please." Elijah thought about Mary, about the scars on his back, about every person this man had dragged back to slavery, every family he'd destroyed. He pulled the tomahawk free and brought it down once, hard and final. When he looked up, the clearing had gone silent. All 5 slave catchers lay dead or dying. The horses, spooked by the violence, had scattered into the forest. Blood stained the creek water running downstream. Solomon was already moving among the bodies, collecting weapons and supplies. Adsila appeared from the ridge, checking her people for injuries. None, apparently. They'd executed the ambush perfectly. Tasunki approached Elijah, studying his face. "How do you feel?" Elijah looked down at the tomahawk in his hand, slick with blood. He waited for guilt, for horror, for his hands to start shaking. Instead, he felt nothing. Just a strange, hollow clarity. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's normal too," Tasunki replied. "The feeling comes later, or it doesn't. Either way, you did what needed doing." He clapped Elijah on the shoulder. "Welcome to the Brotherhood." They worked quickly to erase signs of the camp. The bodies were dragged into the forest and covered with branches and leaves, not buried, but hidden well enough that it would take days or weeks for anyone to find them. The weapons and supplies were divided up. And finally, Tasunki took one of the chains the slave catchers had been carrying, split it in half with a rock and a tomahawk, and carved 2 symbols into a nearby oak tree, a feather and a broken shackle. "Let them find this," he said. "Let them understand." By the time they left the clearing, the sun was high overhead, and the only evidence that 5 men had died there was the rust-colored water flowing downstream and a message carved into wood. The journey back to camp took most of the day. No one spoke much. Ruth walked beside Elijah for a while, not saying anything, just being present. Solomon hummed an old song Elijah recognized from the quarters back on the plantation, a field song about rivers carrying souls to freedom. As they descended into the ravine and the hidden camp came into view, Elijah realized that the hollow no longer felt like a place he was hiding. It felt like something else entirely. It felt like home. That night, after they'd returned and reported to the camp, Adsila presented Elijah with a knife in a worn leather sheath. The handle was carved from deer antler, smooth from years of use. "This belonged to my brother," she said. "He carried it when the soldiers came to force us west. He died fighting them, refusing to leave." She pressed it into Elijah's hands. "He would have wanted you to have it, someone who understands what it means to fight for freedom." Elijah stared at the knife, overwhelmed by the weight of what she was giving him, not just a weapon, but a legacy. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Don't say anything," Adsila replied. "Just honor him by using it well." Later, lying in his shelter, Elijah held the knife and thought about the man he'd killed. He waited for the guilt Ruth had mentioned, the horror that should come from taking a life. It never arrived. Maybe it would tomorrow, or next week, or in dreams yet to come. But tonight, all he felt was a strange sense of completion, like he'd crossed some invisible threshold and could never return to who he'd been before. The forest was changing him, shaping him into something new, something dangerous, something free. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, and the wind moved through the trees like breath. The night brotherhood slept, weapons within reach, dreams full of fire and feathers and chains splitting in half. And in towns across Georgia and Alabama, slave catchers whispered about patrols that never came back, about forests that swallowed men whole, about something moving through the darkness that hunted the hunters. The legend was spreading, and it had only just begun. Winter came to the Georgia forest like a drawn blade, sharp, unforgiving, beautiful in its cruelty. By December, frost covered the ravine walls each morning, and breath hung in the air like smoke. The camp had grown. Word of the Brotherhood spread through the network of runaways and sympathizers, carried in coded songs and whispered conversations in slave quarters across 3 states. 47 people now lived in the hidden hollow, and Tasunke had established 2 additional camps within a day's travel, each one concealed, each one training. Elijah had changed. His hands, once soft from fieldwork, had grown calloused in new ways. He could track a deer through 2 miles of forest without losing the trail. He could move silently enough that even Kuwanyoma sometimes lost him during training exercises. The knife Adsila had given him hung at his belt, and he'd carved 3 notches into the handle, one for each patrol he'd been on, each ambush that ended in blood and silence. He tried not to think about the men he'd killed, tried not to let their faces haunt him when he closed his eyes at night. Mostly, he succeeded. But December brought new problems beyond the cold. Tasunke called a gathering in the main hollow. Everyone assembled around the central fire pit, despite the risk of the smoke being spotted. His face carried the kind of grim tension that meant bad news. "The militias are organizing," he announced without preamble. "Not local patrols anymore, state forces. They've put together a company of 60 men. Professional soldiers, trackers, Seminole scouts they hired away from Florida. They're calling it the Cherokee Suppression Force, but we know what it really is. A hunting party," Solomon said flatly. "For us." Tasunke nodded. "They're being equipped with new rifles, provisions for extended wilderness operations. And they're being led by someone who knows these woods." He paused. "Captain Marcus Bridger. He fought in the Creek Wars, knows guerrilla tactics. Worse, he's part Cherokee himself. His mother's side. He speaks the language, understands our strategies." A murmur ran through the gathered people. Elijah saw fear in some faces, anger in others. "How long before they move?" Adsila asked. "Intelligence says mid-January. They're waiting for a hard freeze to make tracking easier. Frozen ground holds tracks longer, less vegetation to hide movement." Tasunke looked around at his people. "Which means we have 4 weeks to prepare. 4 weeks to decide whether we stay and fight or scatter and survive. We scatter, we lose everything." A man named Jacob spoke up, former slave from a Virginia plantation, one of the best shots with a musket in camp. "All the training, all the supplies, all the safety this place represents. We'll be back to running alone. We stay and fight. Some of us die," Ruth countered. "Maybe all of us. 60 trained soldiers against our, 20 fighters. The rest are children, elders, people who can't fight." The argument grew heated, voices rising. Elijah listened to both sides, understanding the fear behind each position. Scattering meant survival for some, but abandoning the alliance they'd built. Staying meant making a stand, but possibly dying for it. Tasunke let them argue for a while before raising his hand for silence. "I'm not asking for a vote, not yet, but I want everyone to understand what we're facing. This isn't a patrol we can ambush and disappear. This is an army coming to wipe us out. If we fight smart, or we don't fight at all." He turned to Adsila. "How many warriors can we field if we pull from all 3 camps?" 35, maybe 40 who can actually fight," she replied. "Another 15 who could handle support roles, moving supplies, tending wounded, running messages." "Not enough," Solomon said bluntly. "We need an advantage, something that makes up for the numbers." Elijah found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "We need to make them afraid." Everyone turned to look at him. Tasunke raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "The reason the Brotherhood works is because we've become a legend," Elijah said, working through the idea as he spoke. "Slave catchers are terrified to enter the deep forest. They tell stories about us around their fires, about patrols that vanish, about warriors who move like ghosts. That fear is our weapon. So we need to make these soldiers afraid before they ever reach us." "How?" Ruth asked. "Psychological warfare," Adsila said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Hit them while they're still gathering. Make them see what they're walking into. Make them doubt." Tasunke nodded, a predatory smile forming. "Yes, we don't wait for them to come to us. We go to them first. Over the next 3 days, Tasunki assembled a strike team, 8 of their best warriors, including Elijah, Ruth, Solomon, Adsila, and 4 Cherokee fighters who'd been conducting raids for months. Their target was the militia's main staging area in Cartersville, a town 40 miles northeast where the soldiers were assembling. They left the camp at night, moving through the frozen forest under a gibbous moon. The cold was brutal, biting through their layered clothing, but it also worked in their favor. The hard ground made for quiet movement, and the bare trees provided better visibility. It took them 2 days to reach Cartersville. They set up observation posts on the ridgeline overlooking the town, watching the militia prepare. Tents had been erected in a field outside the main settlement. Wagons brought supplies, soldiers drilled in formation, and in the center of it all, directing everything, stood a tall man in a uniform that marked him as Cherokee, Captain Marcus Bridger. "He knows what he's doing," Solomon observed grimly, watching through a spyglass they'd taken from a dead slave catcher months ago. "Look at the sentries, the way the camp is organized. No blind spots, clear fields of fire. Taking this by force would be suicide." "Good thing we're not taking it by force," Tasunki replied. They waited until the 3rd night, when clouds rolled in and covered the moon. The temperature dropped below freezing, and a thin layer of ice formed on the creek running past the camp. Perfect conditions. At midnight, they moved. Elijah and Ruth were assigned to the supply wagons on the southern edge of camp. The sentries there were cold, tired, focused more on staying warm than watching for threats. Ruth moved first, sliding through the darkness like water, her knife finding the first guard's throat before he could make a sound. Elijah took the second, the technique they'd practiced dozens of times now, second nature. Hand over mouth, blade between ribs, lower the body gently. They reached the wagons and went to work. Ruth had become skilled with fire, knew exactly which supplies to burn for maximum impact: gunpowder stores, food rations, spare uniforms. They worked quickly, setting small fires that would take time to grow, giving them a chance to escape before the alarm was raised. Meanwhile, on the northern edge, Solomon and Wire were dealing with the horses. Not killing them, that would be wasteful and cruel, but setting them loose, removing hobbles and opening the makeshift corral gates. 40 horses suddenly free would cause chaos. Tasunke and Adsila had the most dangerous job. They entered the camp itself, moving between tents, leaving messages. On the command tent's entrance, they nailed a broken shackle. On Captain Bridger's personal quarters, a white eagle feather. And on every 10th tent, they carved the symbol of the Brotherhood, the feather and split chain. They were almost clear when someone spotted them. A young soldier, no more than 20, stepped out of a tent to relieve himself and saw Tasunke 20 feet away, knife in hand, symbol fresh carved into the tent pole. For one frozen moment, their eyes met. The soldier opened his mouth to shout. Adsila's arrow took him in the throat. He fell, silently clutching at the shaft, and was dead in seconds. But the damage was done. Someone inside the tent he'd come from must have heard the body fall, because suddenly a voice was yelling, "Intruders! Alarm!" "Run!" Tasunke hissed, and they ran. Behind them, the camp exploded into chaos. The fires Ruth and Elijah had set reached the ammunition stores, and a series of explosions ripped through the southern edge. Horses stampeded in every direction, trampling tents and supplies. Soldiers poured out of their quarters in various states of undress, grabbing weapons, shouting contradictory orders. The strike team converged on the ridge and kept running, putting distance between themselves and the chaos. They ran for 2 hours before Tasunke finally called a halt in a limestone cave system they'd scouted earlier. Everyone was breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing. Solomon was laughing, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the cave walls. "Did you see them?" he wheezed. "Running around like chickens with their heads cut off." Even Tasunke was smiling. "We took out a quarter of their supplies, scattered their horses, and marked them for death. By morning, half those soldiers will be reconsidering their career choices. And Bridger, Adsila asked, will understand exactly what he's walking into, Tasunke replied. He'll find the messages, the symbols, and he'll know that this isn't a group of terrified runaways hiding in the woods. This is an organized, capable force that can strike at him anywhere, anytime. Elijah sat against the cave wall, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline dump. He'd killed another sentry tonight, quick, clinical, necessary. The face would join the others that visited him in dreams. But when he looked around at his companions, Ruth grinning despite the danger, Solomon still chuckling, Tasunke and Adsila exchanging satisfied looks, he felt something else too, pride, purpose. The sense that they just shifted the balance of power in a way that might actually matter. They stayed in the cave system for 2 days, watching from concealed positions as Cartersville dealt with the aftermath. Soldiers searched the surrounding forest, but they were clumsy, loud, easy to avoid. More importantly, Elijah could see the tension in their movements, the way they jumped at shadows, the arguments breaking out between officers. Fear was taking root, exactly as planned. On the second afternoon, a delegation arrived from town. Civilians, led by the mayor, demanding to speak with Captain Bridger. The strike team was too far away to hear the conversation, but the gestures told the story. The mayor was furious, probably concerned about the militia's presence bringing violence to his town. Bridger looked frustrated, defensive. Town's turning on them, Ruth observed. They don't want to be associated with a military force that can't even protect its own camp. And the soldiers know it, Solomon added. Look at them. They're spooked. By the time the strike team returned to the ravine camp, the temperature had dropped even further, and snow was starting to fall, light flurries that dusted the forest in white. The camp greeted them as heroes, people gathering to hear about the raid, children staring wide-eyed as Tasunke recounted their success. But Elijah noticed something concerning in Tasunke's expression during the celebration, a tension in his shoulders that suggested the victory had come, with complications. Later that night, he found Tasunke standing alone at the edge of the ravine, looking out at the falling snow. "What's wrong?" Elijah asked. Tasunke was quiet for a long moment. "We struck a blow tonight, made them afraid, bought ourselves time. But it also means there's no going back. The militia will be out for blood now." "And Captain Bridger," he trailed off. "What about him? He's Cherokee, which means he knows exactly how humiliating this is for him personally. We didn't just damage supplies, we damaged his honor, made him look incompetent in front of his command." Tasunke turned to face Elijah. "When they come for us now, it won't just be duty. It'll be personal. And a man fighting for honor is twice as dangerous." Snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, covering the forest in white. Somewhere to the northeast, 60 soldiers were preparing to march south, and in the hidden ravine, the Night Brotherhood readied itself for a war that would determine not just their survival, but the survival of an idea, that people could fight back, that they could refuse to be hunted, that freedom was worth dying for. The snow fell. The forest waited, and both sides sharpened their blades. January brought a cold snap that froze the Chattahoochee solid in places and turned morning breath into clouds of ice crystals. The Brotherhood had 3 weeks of confirmed intelligence before the militia would move. 3 weeks to prepare for a battle they couldn't win through numbers alone. Tasunke transformed from warrior to general. He divided the fighters into units, each with specific roles. Scouts to provide early warning, skirmishers to harass the militia's advance, a core defense force to protect the camps, supply runners to maintain communication between positions. Every person, regardless of ability, received a job that contributed to survival. Elijah found himself leading a skirmisher unit of 6, 4 men and 2 women, including Ruth. Their job was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Slow the militia's advance, make every mile they traveled toward the camps cost blood and time, then vanish before they could be caught. Think of yourselves as ghosts, Tasunke instructed during a training session. You're not trying to stop them, you're trying to break them. Make every step forward feel like walking through thorns. Make them paranoid, exhausted, jumping at every sound. Atsila taught them the finer points of ambush warfare, where to position themselves for maximum impact and fastest escape, how to set traps that looked natural until they closed, how to use the terrain itself as a weapon. Solomon showed them how to disable men without killing them, leaving wounded soldiers who would slow down their companions and drain morale. A dead man is a tragedy for an hour, Solomon explained, his voice cold and practical. A screaming man with an arrow through his knee is a nightmare that lasts all day. The first week of January passed in intensive preparation. They scouted the likely routes the militia would take, identified choke points and ambush sites, cached weapons and supplies at strategic locations. The forest became a maze designed to kill, with the Brotherhood holding the map. Then, on January 8th, the scouts came back with news. The militia was moving, 60 soldiers, just as reported, plus a dozen civilian scouts and support personnel. Captain Bridger had organized them into 3 columns, each taking a different approach route to prevent a single ambush from crippling the entire force. It was smart, professional, exactly what Tasunke had feared. They'll converge somewhere around the middle fork of the Sweetwater Creek, Tasunke said, studying the crude map they'd drawn on a piece of deer hide. That's 30 miles from here. We have maybe 4 days before they reach our territory. Then we start bleeding them before they get close, Atsila replied. Hit them while they're still confident, still bunched together. Elijah's unit moved out that night, along with 2 other skirmisher groups. They traveled fast, unencumbered by supplies, reaching the militia's eastern column by dawn. From a ridge overlooking their line of march, Elijah watched through the spyglass as soldiers moved through the forest in disciplined formation. Captain Bridger was with this column, Elijah realized. He recognized the officer's bearing, the way other soldiers deferred to him. That made this particular group both the most dangerous and the most important to hit. They waited until the column was passing through a narrow ravine, the soldiers strung out in single file, unable to maneuver effectively. Elijah positioned his people on both sides of the ravine, hidden among the rocks and vegetation. "Remember," he whispered. 3 shots maximum, then we disappear. Don't get pinned down, don't try for glory, wound and run. He gave the signal. 6 bows released simultaneously. 3 soldiers went down, 2 with arrows in their legs, 1 in the shoulder. Before the militia could react, Ruth's musket barked from a different position, the ball striking a soldier in the hip and spinning him around. The column erupted in chaos. Soldiers dived for cover, officers shouted orders, muskets fired wildly at shadows. But Elijah's team was already moving, sliding down the backside of the ridge and into the dense forest beyond. Behind them, they heard Captain Bridger's voice cutting through the confusion. "Hold your fire! They're gone! Get those wounded back to the rear!" It took the militia 20 minutes to reorganize. By then, Elijah's team was half a mile away, circling to set up another position. They hit them twice more that day, once at a creek crossing, once from a tree line as the column made camp. Each time, a few soldiers went down wounded. Each time, the Brotherhood vanished before the militia could mount a response. By nightfall, the eastern column had lost 8 men to injuries, not dead, but unable to continue. Captain Bridger had been forced to send them back to Cartersville with an escort, reducing his fighting force further. The other skirmisher teams reported similar success. The western column had been hit 4 times, losing 6 men. The central column, commanded by a lieutenant named Garrett, had been more cautious, taking a slower route that made them harder to ambush. But they'd still lost 3 soldiers to traps, sharpened stakes hidden in brush, a deadfall that broke a man's leg when he tripped the trigger. That night, Elijah's team made camp in a limestone overhang 5 miles from the militia's position. They didn't light a fire, ate cold rations, kept their voices to whispers. Ruth sat beside Elijah, cleaning her musket by moonlight. "You think it's working, this whole strategy?" "We've wounded 17 soldiers in one day without losing anyone on our side," Elijah replied. "I'd say it's working." "I meant psychologically. Are they breaking?" Elijah thought about Captain Bridger's voice that morning, still controlled, still professional, but with an edge of frustration. "Not yet, but they're starting to understand what they're walking into. Give it another few days." The harassment continued. Day 2 saw the militia columns trying to adapt, sending scouts ahead to check for ambushes, moving more cautiously through vulnerable terrain. But that just slowed them down, which was its own kind of victory. Elijah's team caught a supply wagon that had fallen behind the central column, killed the driver and 2 guards, and burned the contents. Medical supplies, ammunition, food, all gone up in smoke while the main column was too far ahead to respond. On day 3, one of the scouts from the western column was found by his companions with his throat cut and a warning carved into his chest. "Turn back while you can." The militia's response was predictable and exactly what Tasunki had anticipated. They got angry, started moving faster, taking more risks, desperate to close with an enemy they could actually fight. And risks meant mistakes. The western column walked into a carefully prepared ambush on the 4th day. Tasunke had positioned 20 fighters on both sides of a narrow valley, waited until the soldiers were completely committed, then opened fire with bows, muskets, and thrown tomahawks from concealment. The militia took devastating casualties, 12 dead, another 8 wounded, but they'd also responded with professional discipline, forming firing lines and laying down suppressing fire while their wounded were evacuated. 3 Brotherhood fighters were hit in the exchange, 1 dead, 2 wounded. It was the first time they'd lost someone in this campaign. Her name had been Sarah, 23 years old, escaped from a South Carolina plantation 18 months ago. She'd been learning to track, showed promise with a bow, took a musket ball through the chest during the ambush, and died within minutes. They buried her that night in a hollow tree, marked only with stones. No time for proper ceremony, not with the militia still searching for them. But Tasunke led them in a brief prayer, part Cherokee, part Christian, part something older than both, asking the forest to protect her spirit. Elijah stood at the makeshift grave, feeling the weight of command for the first time. Sarah had been in his unit during training. He'd taught her how to move quietly, how to aim, and now she was dead because of a plan he'd helped create. Ruth found him after the burial. "It's not your fault. She was my responsibility. We're all responsible. We all chose this." Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. Sarah knew the risks. She died fighting for freedom. Don't dishonor that by blaming yourself. The militia reached the Sweetwater Creek convergence point on day 5. Elijah watched from a concealed position as the 3 columns finally met, merging into a single force for the final push toward the ravine camps. They'd been reduced to 48 effective fighters, having left behind or sent back nearly 20 men to wounds and exhaustion. Captain Bridger looked haggard, even from a distance. 5 days of constant harassment, of losing men to an enemy he never saw, had taken a toll. But he was still professional, still dangerous, organizing his reduced force with grim efficiency. That night, Bridger did something unexpected. He sent a messenger forward under a white flag, a Cherokee man, maybe 60 years old, carrying only a staff and a message pouch. Tasunke met him at the edge of the Brotherhood's outer perimeter. Elijah accompanied him, along with Adsela and Solomon, weapons ready in case this was a trick. The messenger bowed respectfully. "I am Yonah of the Wolf Clan. Captain Bridger sends his regards and a message." "Speak," Tasunki said. Yonah produced a letter from the pouch and read, To the Cherokee warriors and freedmen of the Knight Brotherhood, I am Captain Marcus Bridger, son of Standing Bear and Elizabeth Bridger of the Paint Clan. I acknowledge your courage and skill. You have fought well with honor, but this conflict serves no one. My orders are to clear these lands and bring order to the territory. Your continued resistance will only lead to more death on both sides. I propose a meeting under truce. You choose the location and terms. Let us speak as warriors, not as animals in the dark. Perhaps there is a solution that doesn't require everyone to die. Signed, Captain Marcus Bridger. Silence followed the reading. Elijah could see the calculation in Tasunke's eyes, weighing the offer, searching for the trap. What does he really want? Adsila asked quietly. To understand what he's fighting, Solomon said, to see if we can be negotiated with, bought off or frightened into submission. Tasunke studied the messenger. You know Bridger personally? I've known him since he was a boy, Yona replied. His mother was my niece. He is Cherokee in blood, though he serves white masters now. But he is not dishonorable. If he offers truce, he will honor it. And after the meeting, Tasunke asked, what then? Yona met his gaze. That depends on what is said, but at least there would be a chance to speak truth before more blood is spilled. Tasunke looked at his companions. Adsila shrugged. Your decision. Solomon frowned, but nodded. Elijah remained silent, waiting. Tell Bridger we will meet him, Tasunke finally said, tomorrow at noon at the Standing Stones near the North Fork. He may bring 3 others. We will do the same. Any betrayal will be answered with total war. Yona bowed again. I will carry your message. After the messenger left, they argued about the decision. Solomon thought it was a mistake, that Bridger was stalling for time or planning a trap. Adsila was cautiously optimistic that maybe, just maybe, a Cherokee officer might be sympathetic to their cause. Elijah kept quiet, uncertain what he believed. You think he's sincere? Ruth asked him later when they were alone. I think he's tired, Elijah replied. Same as us. And maybe he's realized that winning this fight would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. But whether that's enough to make him turn on his orders, he shook his head. I don't know. The next day at noon, Tasunke, Adsila, Solomon, and Elijah arrived at the Standing Stones, an ancient Cherokee ceremonial site, massive limestone formations that jutted from the earth like the fingers of a buried giant. Captain Bridger was already there, accompanied by his second-in-command, the messenger Yona, and a young Cherokee scout. The 2 groups faced each other across 20 feet of open ground. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Captain Bridger stepped forward and did something that shocked everyone present. He removed his hat and spoke in fluent Cherokee. I greet you as kin, not as enemy. I am Standing Bear's son, and I carry his shame that I wear this uniform. Tasunke replied in the same language, and for several minutes they spoke in words Elijah couldn't understand. But he could read the body language. Tension slowly easing, recognition passing between the 2 Cherokee men that they shared something deeper than their current opposition. Finally, they switched back to English for the benefit of everyone present. I'll be honest, Bridger said, his voice weary. I don't want to be here. I didn't volunteer for this assignment, but I'm a soldier and these are my orders. Clear the forest of hostile forces, establish security for the new settlements. If I refuse, they'll just send someone else, probably someone less sympathetic to Cherokee rights or slave suffering. So what do you propose? Tasunke asked. We surrender peacefully and let you drag the runaways back to plantations. No. Bridger's response was immediate and firm. I'm proposing something else. You disperse the camps, move your people west, beyond Georgia's borders. There's Cherokee territory in Arkansas and Oklahoma, contested, but safer than here. I give you 2 weeks to evacuate. In return, I report that you'd already abandoned the area when we arrived. My superiors get their victory, you get to survive. You're asking us to abandon everything we've built, Adsila said. The alliance, the training, the symbol of resistance we represent. I'm asking you to live, Bridger countered. Because if you stay and we fight, many of you will die. And even if you somehow win, if you destroy my entire force, they'll just send a bigger one, then another. Until this forest runs red and your alliance is destroyed utterly. Solomon spat on the ground. So we run, like we've always run. You survive, Bridger corrected. There's no shame in choosing to fight another day on better ground. Tasunki was quiet for a long time, staring at the standing stones as if they might offer guidance. Finally, he spoke. I need to discuss this with my people. Can you give us 3 days? 2, Bridger replied. After that, my orders require me to advance. I'm already pushing the limits of my authority by offering this at all. 2 days, then. Tasunki extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Bridger shook it. The meeting ended. Both groups withdrew, and the forest fell silent again, waiting to see if peace or war would follow. The argument in the Brotherhood Council lasted until dawn. 47 people crammed into the main hollow, voices rising in anger and desperation as they debated Bridger's offer. We accept and we die slowly instead of quickly, Jacob argued, standing near the fire. You think moving west is safety? They're pushing Cherokee off that land too. We'll just be refugees in another territory, hunted by different soldiers. We stay and we die fast, a woman named Hannah countered. 60 soldiers were bad. The next force will be 100, then 200. They have unlimited resources. We have limited fighters. We've built something here, Ruth said, her voice cutting through the noise. A place where runaways can find refuge, where we train people to fight back, where we prove that resistance is possible. If we abandon that, what message does it send? That we're smart enough to survive, Adsila replied. Dead symbols don't inspire anyone. The debate circled endlessly. Those who'd been slaves longer wanted to run, having learned that fighting white authority only brought worse punishment. Those who'd arrived more recently wanted to stand and fight, their anger still fresh and burning. Elijah listened to all of it, trying to understand what the right choice was. Finally, he stood and spoke, surprised by the sound of his own voice carrying through the hollow. I came here broken, he said, carrying nothing but scars and rage. You all took me in, taught me to be something more than a victim, to fight, to matter, to refuse to bow. Because of you, I'm not afraid anymore, and I'm not the only one. He looked around at the faces watching him, people he'd trained with, fought beside, bled for. The Brotherhood isn't this ravine. It isn't these camps. It's an idea that we can fight back, that we don't have to accept chains or exile or death. If we stay here and die, the idea dies with us. But if we leave, carry that idea west, teach it to others, start new camps in new territories. He paused. Maybe that's how we win, not by holding one patch of forest, but by spreading resistance everywhere they can't contain it. Silence followed his words. Then Tasunki stood. Elijah speaks wisdom, he said. We've been thinking like this is our last stand, but what if it's just the beginning? We evacuate, yes, but we don't surrender. We take everything we've learned, everyone we've trained, and we build the Brotherhood again somewhere else. And again, after that, if necessary, we become something they can't kill because we're not tied to one place. Solomon nodded slowly. A network. Not just one alliance, but many. Cells that can operate independently, share information, coordinate attacks across territories. Exactly, Tasunki replied. We turn Bridger's mercy into our strategic advantage. Let them think they've won. Let them think we've scattered and given up, and while they celebrate, we're building something bigger. The mood in the hollow shifted. Despair transformed into possibility. Defeat became strategy. They took a vote. 31-16, they chose to accept Bridger's offer and evacuate west. But it wasn't surrender. It was evolution. The next morning, Tasunke met Bridger again at the Standing Stones and agreed to terms. 2 weeks to evacuate, no pursuit as long as the Brotherhood moved beyond Georgia's borders, and Bridger would report they'd found the camps abandoned. "You're making the right choice," Bridger said. But his voice carried an undercurrent of something else. Maybe respect, maybe regret that he couldn't offer more. "We'll see," Tasunke replied. "But Captain, when you report back to your superiors, tell them this. The Night Brotherhood isn't defeated. We're just changing battlefields. And someday, maybe soon, there will be enough of us that no amount of soldiers will be enough to stop it." Bridger held his gaze. "I believe you. And when that day comes, I hope I'm not the one sent to face you." They shook hands one last time, and the truce held. The evacuation took 12 days of organized chaos. They dismantled the camps, cached weapons and supplies they couldn't carry for future use, and split into 3 groups that would take different routes west to avoid being tracked easily. Some would head to Arkansas Territory, others to Oklahoma, a few north to the Free States, despite the longer journey. Elijah found himself assigned to the Arkansas group, 40 people including Tasunke, Adsila, Ruth, and Solomon. They would establish the first new camp, begin recruiting again, and start building the network Tasunke had envisioned. On their last night in Georgia, Elijah climbed to the edge of the ravine and looked out over the forest. The trees stood silent and dark, holding secrets he'd learned in blood and pain. This place had transformed him from a terrified runaway into something harder, sharper, capable. He thought about the men he'd killed. The faces still visited him sometimes, but less frequently now. He'd made peace with what he'd become, understanding that some choices don't offer clean solutions, only necessary ones. Ruth appeared beside him, silent as ever. They stood together watching the forest breathe. "You think we'll make it?" she asked. "Build something that lasts." "I think we'll try," Elijah replied. "And that's more than most people ever get." "What will you do after?" He considered the question. "Keep training people, keep fighting. There are millions still in chains, Ruth, millions who don't know they have another option. If the Brotherhood can show even a fraction of them that resistance is possible," he trailed off. "It won't be enough," Ruth said quietly. "Not in our lifetimes. This evil is too big, too embedded." "Maybe. But we plant seeds, and someday those seeds become forests." Elijah touched the knife at his belt, Adsila's brother's knife, carrying the weight of sacrifice. "We just have to make sure the idea survives long enough to take root." They left before dawn, 40 souls moving silently through the forest one last time. Behind them, Captain Bridger's militia found empty camps, cold fire pits, and scattered supplies. They searched for 3 days, found nothing, and eventually reported back to their superiors that the Night Brotherhood had disbanded and fled. The Georgia newspapers celebrated the victory. Plantation owners breathed easier. Slave catchers resumed their work with renewed confidence. And in the forests of Arkansas Territory, in the hollows of Oklahoma, in hidden places across 1,000 miles, former slaves and Cherokee refugees began gathering again. They trained in the darkness, passed down the techniques Tasunke had taught, told stories about the Georgia camps where the alliance was born. The symbols appeared on trees across 3 territories, a feather and a broken chain. Supply wagons vanished along trading routes. Patrols disappeared into wilderness, and in slave quarters across the South, songs began circulating with new verses. The forest remembers who fought for the chained brothers in darkness with nothing to lose. They taught us the weapons, they taught us the ways. Now shadows have teeth and the night holds the news. The government tried to suppress the legend. Plantation owners offered rewards for information. Militias were sent to investigate reports of organized resistance, but legends don't die when you kill the people who started them. They grow stronger, feeding on hope and rage in equal measure. 10 years later, A Union officer in Arkansas would report encountering black soldiers fighting for the Confederate Army with Cherokee allies, using guerrilla tactics and forest warfare that seemed impossibly sophisticated for irregular forces. He would note in his report that prisoners claimed to be part of something called the Brotherhood, though they refused to say more. 20 years later, during Reconstruction, freed slaves in Georgia would establish hidden communities in the same forests where the original camps had stood, using knowledge passed down through oral tradition about survival and resistance. 50 years later, historians would dismiss the stories as myth, the Night Brotherhood reduced to footnote, to legend, to convenient fiction that probably never happened. But in Oklahoma, in families descended from Cherokee who refused to leave their land and slaves who refused to stay in chains, a different story was preserved, kept alive in careful genealogies and whispered histories, in heirlooms passed from generation to generation, knives with carved handles, arrowheads marked with specific symbols, copies of crude maps showing where camps once stood. The forest remembered, the people remembered, and the idea that resistance is possible, that chains can be broken, that ordinary people can become warriors when given no other choice, survived. Elijah lived to see the Civil War begin. He was 47 years old when Fort Sumter fell, had spent 16 years building Brotherhood cells across 4 territories. By then, he commanded a network of nearly 300 fighters, former slaves, Cherokee resistors, white abolitionists, free blacks from the North, anyone willing to fight for the principle that no person should own another. When Union recruiters came through Arkansas looking for black soldiers, Elijah presented himself and 89 others who'd been trained in the Brotherhood way. The recruiter looked at them skeptically, a ragged band of civilians with mismatched weapons and no formal military training. Then Elijah demonstrated what they could do. How they moved through forest terrain, how they tracked and ambushed, how they turned any landscape into a killing ground for unprepared enemies. The recruiter recruited them immediately, formed them into a special unit attached to the Army of the Southwest. They spent the war conducting reconnaissance, ambushing Confederate supply lines, and training other black soldiers in guerrilla warfare. Confederate soldiers began telling stories about ghost troops that appeared from nowhere, struck like lightning, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. About a black officer with scars on his back and a bone-handled knife who led them with the discipline of a trained soldier and the ruthlessness of a man who'd learned warfare in slavery's shadow. They called him the Forest Devil. His own men called him Captain. Elijah called himself what he'd always been, a survivor who'd learned that survival alone wasn't enough, that sometimes freedom required blood, and that the chains that bound people weren't just made of metal, but of fear and resignation, and the belief that resistance was impossible. The Brotherhood taught him otherwise, and he spent the rest of his life teaching others. When Elijah died in 1883, at 70 years old, more than 500 people attended his funeral. Black, white, Cherokee, veterans, civilians, people whose lives he'd touched in ways large and small. They buried him in Arkansas, on land the Brotherhood had purchased, in a cemetery where former slaves and Cherokee allies lay together. His gravestone was simple: Elijah Freeman, born in chains, died free. He taught the forest to remember, but the real legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was carried forward in the thousands of people who'd been touched by the Brotherhood's teachings, who'd learned that oppression could be fought, that ordinary people could become extraordinary when they had no choice, that the night belonged to those brave enough to claim it. The history books wouldn't remember. Official records would dismiss the stories as exaggeration or myth. But in the communities that mattered, in the families who survived, in the traditions that persisted, in the fierce pride of descendants who knew their ancestors had refused to bow, the truth endured. The Night Brotherhood was real. The alliance existed. And for a brief, shining moment in the darkest period of American history, slaves and Cherokee warriors stood together in the Georgia forest and proved that resistance was possible. They called it rebellion. The Cherokee called it honor. History called it fiction because the truth was too dangerous to let survive in the light. But the forest remembered. The people remembered. And in the end, that was enough. The forest remembers who fought for the chained, and the chains, in time, all fall away.